He was a man who owned nothing but the shame in his eyes, and she was a woman who owned everything but the warmth in her heart. All it took was one desperate, whispered lie to change everything. Hi dear esteemed viewer. Welcome to our channel. Kindly hit the subscribe button so you can get notifications for our new beautiful stories. The rain in the city had a way of making everything look equally miserable, whether it was the gleaming chrome of a luxury sedan or the worn-down soles of a pair of discount store shoes. Leo felt the truth of this as he trudged up the hill, his delivery bag held tight against his chest, trying to shield the groceries from the downpour. The water had long since seeped through his thin jacket, and a chill was settling deep into his bones. He focused on the rhythm of his steps, the weight of the bag, anything to keep his mind from wandering back to the hollow silence of his studio apartment. The house at the top of the hill was a monument of glass and ambition, a stark contrast to the building he lived in, where the ambition was simply to make next month's rent. He rang the bell, shifting his weight, and wiped a muddy hand on his already stained trousers. The door was opened not by a staff member, but by a woman whose smile was as polished and impersonal as the marble floor in the foyer behind her. It was Chloe, his Chloe, or rather she had been a lifetime ago. Leo. Her perfectly sculpted eyebrows lifted in surprise, then dipped into a frown of pity. Oh, you're delivering now. The heat of 1,000 shames rushed to his face. Chloe. Hi. I didn't know this was your. She took the bag from him, her gaze flickering from his rain-soaked hair to his worn-out shoes. The silence was louder than the storm. We're having a little gathering next week, she said, her voice suddenly bright false. A charity gala for the children's hospital. You should come. She reached for a small, thick envelope from a hall table and pressed it into his hand before he could refuse. It was an invitation, heavy with embossed lettering. It felt like a lead weight. It would be good for you to get out. See people. He knew what it was. It wasn't an invitation. It was a benchmark. A chance for her to measure how far he had fallen and how high she had climbed. He stood there, dripping on her pristine welcome mat, the engraved card burning a hole in his palm. Across the city, in a penthouse that seemed to float above the clouds, Alara Roth was also preparing for the Children's Hospital Gala. Her preparation, however, was a military operation. She stood, a statue of cool elegance, as her assistant, David, read from a tablet. The keynote is at 8:15. You've already pre-approved the speech. The Thompson merger team will be there, so a brief, positive interaction is advised. The press is expecting a comment on the quarterly earnings, so we've prepared the standard cautious optimism statement. David's voice was a steady, monotonous hum. Alara nodded, fastening a diamond stud to her ear. The jewel was cold against her skin. And the guest list? Any surprises? The usual. Socialites, philanthropists, a few minor celebrities. Oh, and Chloe Bennett, your former wife's new venture capital partner, will be hosting. She's been quite successful since the split. A muscle in Alara's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Success is often a matter of opportunity and a lack of sentiment, David. Note it down. She surveyed her reflection in the floor-to-ceiling window. The woman staring back was powerful, impeccable, and utterly alone in a room full of the city's lights. She owned the view, but the view didn't talk back. It didn't ask for anything. It didn't disappoint. It was safe. This gala, like every other event, was a transaction. A performance. She was playing the part of Alara Roth, CEO, and she was the only one who knew how exhausting it was to wear that skin. Later, as her driver navigated the slick streets towards the venue, she allowed herself one moment of vulnerability, her forehead resting against the cool glass of the car window. She remembered a time when charity galas meant getting dressed up for a cause she believed in, not for a corporate strategy. She remembered a time when love wasn't a liability to be managed. She shut the memory down, her expression hardening back into its practiced, neutral mask. Sentiment was a luxury her position could not afford. Leo stood at the edge of the glittering ballroom, feeling like a ghost in a world of the living. He'd spent his last decent money on renting a tuxedo that fit him a little too well, a pathetic attempt to look like he still belonged. He spotted Chloe across the room, laughing, her hand resting on the arm of a man in a bespoke suit. She looked happy. She looked like she had won. His presence was a mistake. Every laugh felt like it was directed at him, every glance a measurement of his failure. He was about to turn and flee, to swallow his pride and admit defeat, when his eyes landed on another solitary figure. She stood near a grand piano, a champagne flute held but not drunk from, her gaze scanning the room with a detached, almost bored expression. He recognized her from business magazines, Ilara Roth, one of the youngest, most ruthless CEOs in the tech industry. She was stunning, but in the way a glacier is, beautiful, powerful, and utterly untouchable. She exuded an aura of such complete self-containment that it created an invisible force field around her. No one dared approach. And in that moment, a crazy, desperate, insane idea bloomed in Leo's mind. It was a Hail Mary pass of social survival. If he was going to be humiliated, he would go out on his own terms. He would use the most unapproachable person in the room as his shield. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat of panic and audacity. He took a deep breath and started walking towards her. Each step Leo took across the polished ballroom floor felt like a mile. The murmur of conversation, the clinking of crystal, the swell of the string quartet, it all faded into a dull roar in his ears, a soundtrack to his own impending social suicide. His palms were slick with sweat, and he wiped them surreptitiously on the rented tuxedo trousers. He could feel Chloe's eyes on him, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck. He knew she was watching, probably wondering what the hell he was doing. Ilara Roth saw him coming. Of course she did. In her world, you always noted approaching variables. He was an unknown element, a man with a desperate look in his eyes that didn't match the expensive, if slightly ill-fitting, tuxedo. She assessed him coolly, her expression giving away nothing. A failed businessman? An ambitious reporter? She prepared a polite, firm dismissal, already forming the words in her mind. I'm not giving any comments tonight. Or perhaps just a simple icy "can I help you?" that would freeze him in his tracks. He stopped a few feet from her, close enough to speak, but not so close as to be intrusive. The scent of her perfume reached him, something cold and elegant, like frost on a winter rose. It was a stark contrast to the cheap soap he used. "Ms. Roth," he began, his voice barely more than a whisper, rough with tension. She turned her head a fraction, her gaze sweeping over him. "I'm afraid I'm not doing interviews," she said, her voice low and perfectly modulated, a sound that promised neither warmth nor welcome. "It's not that," Leo rushed out, his heart trying to beat its way out of his chest. He could see Chloe and her new husband starting to move in their direction, curious smiles on their faces. This was it. This was the moment. He had seconds. He leaned in slightly, his body blocking the view of anyone else, creating a small, intimate bubble of space in the crowded room. His eyes, wide and pleading, locked with hers. In that moment, all his pride was gone, stripped away, leaving only raw, unvarnished need. He was a man about to drown, and she was a distant, solid shore. "I know this is insane," he whispered, the words tumbling out in a rushed, frantic plea. "And I have no right to ask you this. None. But my ex-wife is coming over. She's the one who invited me here, to see this." He gestured weakly at the opulence around them. "Please. You're the only person in this room who looks like you wouldn't care. Pretend like we are dating, please." The words hung in the air between them, fragile and absurd. Ilara stared at him, her professional composure for once genuinely stunned into silence. Of all the things she had been prepared for, a pitch, a complaint, a sycophantic compliment, this was not on the list. A pretend relationship? It was the kind of ridiculous, sentimental plot from a bad romantic comedy. It was beneath her. It was chaotic. It was emotional. Her first instinct was to laugh in his face. Her second was to call security. But then she looked into his eyes. She saw the profound humiliation warring with a last, desperate stand of courage. She saw the tremor in his hand that he tried to hide. This wasn't a scheme. This was a man trying to salvage one last shred of his dignity in front of the person who had taken the rest. And in that, she saw a reflection of something she understood all too well. The performance, the mask, the desperate need to control how the world sees you. Her gaze flickered over his shoulder. She saw the woman, Chloe, approaching with a predatory smile. She saw the whole, pathetic scene laid out before her. She could end it with one word. No. But something stopped her. A long-buried part of her that was tired of the corporate scripts, the calculated moves, the endless, lonely performances. This was a different kind of role. An irrational one. A human one. Time, which had seemed to slow to a crawl, snapped back. Chloe was just a few feet away. Alara's decision was made in a heartbeat. She didn't smile. She didn't take his arm. Instead, she did something far more intimate, far more convincing. She reached out and, with a startling gentleness, straightened the lapel of his tuxedo jacket, her fingers brushing against the fabric for a brief, electric moment. Her touch was cool and sure. She looked from his lapel up to his eyes, and for the first time all evening, a genuine, subtle warmth touched her own. It was a masterclass in subtle acting. "There," she said, her voice softening just enough to be audible only to him, yet carrying the perfect tone of fond familiarity. "You always were a little rumpled, Leo." The use of his name, spoken with such casual affection, was a lightning strike. Leo felt the air leave his lungs. He stared at her, utterly disbelieving. She hadn't just agreed, she had committed. She had given him a history. It was in that exact moment that Chloe arrived, her smile faltering as she took in the scene. The powerful Alara Roth, her hand lingering on Leo's chest, looking at him with an expression that could only be described as tender. "Leo," Chloe said, her voice laced with confusion. "I see you've found a friend." Alara turned her head slowly, her gaze settling on Chloe. The warmth in her eyes didn't vanish, but it cooled into a polite, protective shield. She slid her hand down Leo's arm and laced her fingers through his. Her grip was firm, grounding. "Chloe, isn't it?" Alara said, her tone now one of polite, distant recognition, the kind used for minor business associates. "Yes, Leo was just telling me how kind it was of you to invite him. It gave us a chance to catch up." She gave Leo's hand a slight, reassuring squeeze. It felt like a lifeline. It felt like a miracle. And in the center of the glittering gala, with his hand in hers, Leo felt the world tilt on its axis. The desperate lie had landed, and its aftershocks were just beginning. The performance lasted for 10 more agonizingly perfect minutes. Alara was flawless. She traded polite barbs with Chloe, her comments laced with a subtle, unshakable superiority that made Chloe's smile grow increasingly strained. She introduced Leo to a passing investor not as my date, but as Leo, with a weight that suggested his single name should be enough, and the investor, suitably impressed, shook Leo's hand with genuine interest. Leo, for his part, said very little. He simply stood there, his hand still enveloped in Alara's, feeling the ghost of her touch searing through the fabric of his rented suit. He was a buoy in a storm, and she was the anchor. When Chloe finally excused herself, her confidence visibly rattled, the spell broke. Alara's hand slipped from his as if she'd been burned. The warmth in her eyes vanished, replaced by the cool, detached expression he'd seen from across the room. The glacier had returned. "That should suffice," she said, her voice once again a low, impersonal murmur. She didn't look at him, but scanned the room as if looking for her next, more important appointment. I don't know how to thank you," Leo stammered, the adrenaline beginning to recede, leaving a cold wash of reality and shame in its wake. "What you did, it was a momentary impulse," she cut him off, finally turning her gaze to him. "It was analytical, not unkind, but distant. You were in a difficult position. I intervened. Think nothing of it." She was already turning away, the transaction complete. But the universe, it seemed, had other ideas. A stout, beaming man in an impeccably tailored tuxedo stepped into their path, clapping his hands together. "Alara, there you are." I saw you from across the room and simply had to come over. You've been hiding your companion." The man's eyes twinkled as he extended a hand to Leo. "Charles Whitlock." "And you are?" Leo froze. Alara's posture went rigid. They were trapped. Leo managed to say, shaking the man's hand. "Leo, a man of few words, I see." "I like that," Charles boomed. "Alara, you never mentioned seeing anyone. This is a wonderful surprise. You must both join us at our table for a nightcap after the auction." "I insist. My wife will be thrilled. She's been saying for years you work too hard, Alara. It's good to see you, living a little." The invitation hung in the air, a gilded trap. To refuse would be bizarre, a social snub that would raise more questions than their charade had answered. Alara's smile was a tight, thin line. "That's very kind, Charles. We'll see if we can manage it." "Excellent. I'll hold you to it." Charles winked and moved back into the crowd, leaving a vacuum of tense silence in his wake. The moment he was gone, Alara let out a soft, frustrated breath. "This is becoming complicated." "I can just leave," Leo offered, his own desire to escape warring with a strange, unplaceable desire to stay. "I can say I'm not feeling well. And have Charles Whitlock, who sits on 3 boards I'm currently negotiating with, think I've driven you away with my famously chilly demeanor?" "No." She finally looked at him, and for the first time he saw a crack in her armor. A flicker of genuine annoyance, not at him, but at the situation. "We've created a narrative. Now we have to see it through to a logical, and more importantly, a quiet conclusion." They stood there, 2 reluctant allies bound by a lie. Leo felt a fresh wave of guilt. He had pulled her into his mess, and now it was threatening to spill over into her pristine, controlled world. "I'm so sorry. This is my fault." "Apologies are unproductive," she stated, her business persona reasserting itself. "We need an exit strategy. A plausible one." She glanced toward the main entrance. "My driver is scheduled for 11:30. It's currently 10:45. We need to be seen together, but not 2 together. We will circulate, separately but in proximity. We will then leave together, calmly and without fanfare. We will be seen getting into my car. The story will be that it was a pleasant, but casual evening. Nothing more. It was a sound plan. A logical plan. It was exactly the kind of plan he would have expected from her. But hearing it laid out so clinically made something in his chest tighten. The brief, terrifying, and exhilarating feeling of connection, of being saved, was being systematically dismantled and filed away as a problem to be managed. "Right. Of course." "A quiet conclusion," he repeated, the words tasting like ash. She gave a curt nod, her eyes already scanning the room for the most efficient path of circulation. The tenderness she had feigned for Chloe was gone, replaced by a cool efficiency that was, he suspected, far more authentic. He watched her for a moment as she began to move away, a solitary figure once more, navigating the crowd with practiced ease. He had gotten what he asked for. The pretend relationship was over almost as soon as it had begun. The shield was being taken away, and he was left exposed again. But the strange thing was, the humiliation he had feared from Chloe no longer seemed to matter. The only thing he felt now was the cold emptiness where her hand had been, and a profound sense of loss for a connection that had never been real in the first place. The resistance wasn't just from her. It was blooming within him too, a defense against the foolish hope that had sparked to life in his chest when she'd said his name like she knew him. The next 45 minutes were a masterclass in subtle, excruciating theater. Leo followed Alara's unspoken plan, circulating on the periphery of her orbit. He would linger near a sculpture while she spoke to a group of investors. He would get a glass of water from the bar as she exchanged pleasantries with a city official. They were like 2 distant planets, their gravitational pull invisible to everyone but themselves. Occasionally, their eyes would meet across the room. Hers would be a brief, neutral check-in before flicking away. His, he feared, held a question he didn't dare to voice. He watched her. He saw how she held herself, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes, the efficient way she extracted herself from conversations that had served their purpose. She wasn't just playing a role tonight, this was her role. The CEO, the millionaire, the unapproachable, and he began to see the immense loneliness that came with it. No one spoke to her for long. No one touched her, aside from the occasional handshake. She was a monument, and people visited, but no one stayed. When the clock finally neared 11:25, a collective shift occurred. The auction was over, and the crowd began to thin. Leo felt a nervous anticipation. The end was in sight. He made his way towards the grand foyer, where Alara was already waiting, her small clutch purse held in front of her like a piece of armor. She gave him a barely perceptible nod. This was it. The calm, quiet exit. Just as they moved towards the towering glass doors, Charles Whitlock appeared again, his face a mask of disappointment. Leaving so soon? The night is young. My wife never got a chance to chat with you, Leo. Alara's smile was polished and final. I'm afraid we have an early start tomorrow, Charles. It was a wonderful evening. Before Charles could protest further, they slipped out into the cool night air. The valet stand was a flurry of activity. The pretense was almost over. Leo took a deep breath, the city air feeling like freedom after the stifling atmosphere inside. And then the sky opened. It wasn't the gentle rain from earlier. This was a torrential biblical downpour, a solid sheet of water that fell with such force it bounced off the pavement and drenched the hems of their formal wear in seconds. The valets scrambled under oversized umbrellas, but it was a losing battle. Alara's phone was at her ear instantly. David. The car. Where is it? A pause. Her expression tightened. A multi-car accident on the bridge? How long? Another longer pause. Her shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. I see. No, there's nothing to be done. Keep me updated. She ended the call and looked at Leo, a new, profound frustration in her eyes. There's been an accident. My driver is gridlocked. He can't get here for at least an hour. They stood under the scant protection of the venue's awning, watching the rain. The street was a chaos of honking cars and struggling umbrellas. Hailing a cab was an impossibility. They were stranded. Leo could feel the social chasm reopening. He could offer to call for a rideshare, but the wait would be just as long, and the act of them separating here in the pouring rain felt strangely wrong, an admission of defeat. He shoved his hands in his pockets. Well, this is unfortunate. Alara stared out at the deluge, her jaw set. This was not part of the plan. This was chaos. This was a variable she could not control. She was calculating the discomfort of waiting here for an hour versus the utter humiliation of trying to wade through the storm in a couture gown. After a long, tense silence, she let out a slow, controlled breath, as if releasing a fraction of the pressure building inside her. She turned to him, her decision made. My apartment is 6 blocks from here, she said, her voice devoid of inflection. We can walk it. It's ill-advised, but preferable to remaining here as a spectacle. She glanced at his thin tuxedo jacket. You'll be drenched. It wasn't an invitation. It was a logistical solution. But it was a solution that involved them going to the same place. Together. A little water never hurt anyone, Leo said, a weak attempt at bravado. She gave him a look that suggested she highly doubted that axiom, but she simply nodded. Then let's go. She didn't wait for him. She stepped out from under the awning and into the punishing rain, gasping slightly as the cold water instantly plastered her elegant updo to her neck and soaked through the silk of her dress. Leo followed, the water feeling like 1,000 icy needles. They didn't speak as they walked. They just powered through the downpour, two figures in ruined formal wear, a world away from the glittering gala. The silence between them was no longer just awkward. It was charged, filled with the drumming of the rain and the sheer, bizarre reality of their situation. He was walking through a storm with a millionaire CEO because of a lie he'd told. It was too strange to be anything but fate or a very elaborate form of punishment. After 3 blocks, Alara, shivering visibly, ducked under the canopy of a closed boutique. Leo joined her, his own teeth beginning to chatter. "This is ridiculous," she muttered, wringing out a section of her soaked hair. "Look on the bright side," Leo said, a genuine, wry smile touching his lips for the first time all night. "No one who saw us at the gala would ever believe we'd end up like this. The story ends here. It's the perfect, quiet conclusion." She looked at him, water dripping from her nose, her mascara starting to smudge. For a second, he saw not the CEO, but a woman cold, tired, and caught in a ridiculous situation. And then something miraculous happened. A short, surprised laugh escaped her. It was a real laugh, husky and unpolished. "The quiet conclusion is currently drowning us," she said, the ghost of the laugh still in her voice. And in that moment, under a cheap awning in a thunderstorm, the forced proximity didn't feel like a burden anymore. It felt like the beginning of something else entirely. The remaining 3 blocks were a waterlogged blur. By the time they stumbled into the sleek, silent lobby of Alara's building, they were a spectacle of a different kind. The doorman, impeccably dressed and perfectly dry, barely blinked. "Good evening, Ms. Roth." "Nasty weather," he said, his tone neutral as he held the door. "Indeed, Gerald," Alara replied, her voice regaining some of its customary composure, though it was undercut by the steady drip 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 from the hem of her gown onto the polished marble floor. The elevator ride to the penthouse was a study in silence. Leo stood awkwardly, trying not to shake too much water onto the pristine carpet. Alara stared straight ahead at the reflective doors, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool, damp silk, and unspoken questions. The elevator doors opened directly into her home. It wasn't just an apartment, it was a realm. A vast, open space of floor-to-ceiling windows showcased a dizzying, rain-blurred panorama of the city lights. The interior was all cool grays, minimalist furniture, and stark, modern art. It was breathtakingly beautiful and utterly soulless. There were no photographs, no knickknacks, no signs that a human being actually lived here. It looked like a museum exhibit titled The Successful Life. "Wait here," Alara instructed, her voice echoing slightly in the cavernous space. She disappeared down a hallway, leaving a trail of wet footprints. Leo stood rooted to the spot, afraid to move. He felt like a muddy dog that had wandered into a surgical theater. He looked around, his eyes searching for any crack in the perfection. A stack of books? A forgotten coffee mug? There was nothing. The only thing out of place was him. Alara returned moments later, having shed her ruined gown. She wore simple, expensive-looking black trousers and a soft gray cashmere sweater. The transformation was startling. Without the armor of her couture, with her damp hair loose around her shoulders, she looked younger. Softer. More real. She carried a thick, white towel and a dark robe, which she handed to him. "The bathroom is there," she said, pointing to a discreet door. "You can change. I'll see if I can salvage your clothes." "Thank you," Leo said, his voice hoarse. He took the items, the towel impossibly plush in his hands. In the bathroom, which was larger than his entire studio, he peeled off the soaked tuxedo. The steam from the hot shower he couldn't bring himself to use fogged the mirrors. He dried off and put on the robe. It was made of a material that felt like liquid silk, and it smelled faintly of her perfume. That same frosty, elegant scent. The absurdity of it all washed over him again. He, Leo, who counted his change for a loaf of bread, was wearing a $1,000 robe in a multi-million-dollar penthouse. When he emerged, he found her in the kitchen, a space of gleaming steel and dark stone. She had laid his jacket and shirt over 2 chairs near a heating vent. She was pouring amber liquid from a crystal decanter into 2 glasses. "Whiskey," she said, not a question. She handed him one. "It seems necessary." He took the glass, their fingers brushing. A jolt, small but undeniable, passed between them. She didn't acknowledge it, turning to lean against the counter and sip her own drink. He gestured with his glass towards the breathtaking, empty view. "It's quite a place. It doesn't feel." He trailed off, searching for the right word. "Lived in?" she finished for him, a wry twist to her lips. "No, it's not meant to. It's a statement. A very expensive, very cold statement." She took another sip. "I bought it after the divorce. A fresh start. A sterile one." This was the first personal thing she had volunteered. Leo stayed silent, letting the space between them fill with something other than rain and pretense. As he moved to set his glass down on the counter, the worn leather wallet in the pocket of his rented trousers, which he'd carried with him to the bathroom, slipped from his grasp. It fell to the floor, spilling its meager contents. A few crumpled bills, a library card, and a small, faded, laminated ticket stub. He knelt quickly, his face flushing, scrambling to gather the evidence of his poverty. But Alara was faster. Her eyes, sharp and perceptive, had locked onto the ticket stub. It was for a concert. The Midnight Echoes. A band that had been popular a decade ago. Her breath caught. It was a tiny, almost inaudible sound, but in the silence of the penthouse, it was like a gunshot. She looked from the ticket stub on the floor to his face, her analytical gaze now sharp with a dawning, painful understanding. "The Midnight Echoes," she whispered. "They were my sister's favorite band." Leo froze, his hand hovering over the stub. He looked up at her, the shame and the grief he usually kept buried rising to the surface. He saw the shock in her eyes, the connection being made. "My wife," he said, the words torn from him, raw and honest. "Lena, it was our first date. She kept the stubs from every concert, every movie we ever saw. She said they were the receipts for our happiness." He picked up the fragile piece of paper, handling it as if it were a holy relic. "She died 2 years ago. A sudden aneurysm. There 1 minute, gone the next." The confession hung in the air, sucking all the oxygen from the room. The pretense of the gala, the millionaire, the poor man, it all fell away. There was only a man holding a piece of his dead wife, and a woman staring at him as if seeing a ghost. Alara's face had gone pale. "I lost my sister," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Clara. 7 years ago. Car accident." The Midnight Echoes, she played their album on a loop. She wrapped her arms around herself, the cool CO completely gone, replaced by a woman haunted by a shared, painful echo. "That's why I went to the gala tonight. The Children's Hospital, it was her favorite charity." In the space of a minute, the invisible walls between them had not just cracked, they had shattered. The mystery of his pain had been revealed, and in doing so had unearthed her own. The pretend date was over. The real one, steeped in a shared, unexpected language of loss, had just begun. Have you ever found that a shared, painful memory with someone created a deeper connection than any happy one could? For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the city through the rain-streaked glass and the soft, almost imperceptible patter of their heartbeats. The air, which had been cold and sterile, now felt charged, thick with the weight of their shared confessions. They were no longer a CEO and a poor man. They were 2 people standing over the open graves of their pasts, recognizing the same shadow in each other's eyes. Alara was the first to move. She pushed herself away from the counter, her movements slow, deliberate. She didn't look at him with pity, nor with the clinical detachment from before. She looked at him with a profound, weary understanding. "She kept the receipts for your happiness," Alara repeated softly, the phrase feeling both foreign and deeply familiar on her tongue. Clara, she had a jar. A big, ugly ceramic jar she'd made in a pottery class. She called it her joy jar. She'd fill it with everything. Movie tickets, dried flowers from a walk, a note from a friend. She was always trying to get me to start one. A ghost of a smile touched her lips, there and gone in an instant. I told her it was sentimental clutter, that you couldn't quantify joy. Leo watched her, the robe feeling less like a costume and more like a shield against the vulnerability in the room. And what did she say to that? Alara's gaze drifted to the stormy cityscape. She said, "Alara, you quantify everything else. Your stocks, your profits, your time. Why not quantify the only thing that actually matters?" She let out a slow breath, a confession in itself. I thought she was naive. "And now?" Leo asked, his voice gentle. "Now I think I was the one who didn't understand the assignment," she admitted, turning her head to look at him. The admission seemed to cost her something, but also to lighten a burden he hadn't known she was carrying. He looked down at the ticket stub still in his hand. "After she died, I sold everything. The house, the car. I used the money to try and keep her dream, a little community art studio, afloat. It didn't work. I failed at that too." The shame he'd felt at the gala was back, but this time, it was quieter, begging for absolution. "You didn't fail," Alara said, her tone firm, leaving no room for argument. It was the voice she used in boardrooms, but it was directed with a new, startling kindness. "You loved her. You fought for her memory. That is not failure. That is," she paused, searching for the word. "That is loyalty. It's the rarest currency there is." Her words landed in the center of his chest, a balm on a wound that had been festering for 2 years. No one had ever framed it that way. They saw the bankruptcy, the downward spiral. They didn't see the love that had driven it. Driven by an impulse he didn't understand, he walked over to the counter and picked up his whiskey glass. He held it out to her. "To Lena," he said, his voice thick. "And to Clara." A flicker of surprise, then something softer, crossed her face. She picked up her own glass and clinked it gently against his. "To the joy jars and the ticket stubs," she whispered. They drank. The whiskey burned, but it was a clean, clarifying burn. The conversation that followed was unlike any Leo had ever had. They didn't talk about the weather or current events. They talked about the silly, sacred details of the people they had lost. Leo told her about Lena's terrible singing in the car, how she could never keep a plant alive, how her laugh could light up a room. Alara, hesitantly at first, then with growing warmth, shared stories of Clara's rebellious streak, her terrible taste in boyfriends, the way she'd drag a reluctant Alara to dive bars to hear unknown bands. They found themselves sitting on the vast, low sofa, the lights of the city their only illumination. At one point, Leo made a comment about the sheer size of the television screen, calling it a cinema for one, and Alara let out a genuine, full-throated laugh. "It's ridiculous, isn't it?" she said, shaking her head. "I think I've turned it on twice." "What do you do here, then?" he asked, gesturing to the expansive, empty space. "When you're not being CEO?" She considered the question, her smile fading into a more thoughtful expression. "I work. I read reports. I plan. I wait for the next day to begin." She looked around her own home as if seeing it for the first time. "It's not living, is it? It's waiting." "It doesn't have to be," he said softly. The look she gave him then was unguarded, searching. The fragility of their bond was palpable, a delicate thread spun from shared grief and unexpected laughter. In this quiet, dark space, with the storm raging outside, the world and its labels had fallen away. He wasn't a poor man. She wasn't a millionaire. They were just Leo and Alara, two people who had found a moment of peace, a harbor in each other, and the terrifying, exhilarating possibility that healing might not be a solitary journey after all. For the first time in years, it felt like a new day was already beginning, right here in the heart of the night. The fragile peace of the night shattered with the piercing buzz of Alara's intercom. The sound was a violent intrusion, jerking them both back to reality. The warm, intimate bubble popped. Alara's CEO mask, which had softened into something approaching humanity, snapped back into place with an almost audible click. She stood, smoothing the cashmere of her sweater, a familiar tension returning to her shoulders. "Yes, Gerald? Apologies for the hour, Ms. Roth." The doorman's voice filtered through, tinny and deferential. "A Mr. David is here. He says it's urgent. Send him up." The air in the room grew cold. Leo stood up, suddenly feeling exposed and ridiculous in the silk robe. The spell was broken. The real world, in the form of her impeccably dressed assistant, was arriving to reclaim her. The elevator doors opened and David strode in, his tablet held before him like a shield. He was dry, precise, and his eyes swept over the scene. The 2 glasses of whiskey, Leo in a robe, Alara with her hair down, with a swift, professional assessment that missed nothing. A flicker of surprise was quickly suppressed. "Alara, my apologies for the intrusion," he began, his tone urgent. "But we have a situation that couldn't wait." He swiped on his tablet and handed it to her. "This went live 20 minutes ago." Leo watched as Alara's face transformed. The softness he'd seen just moments before drained away, replaced by a stony pallor. Her lips pressed into a bloodless line. He didn't need to see the screen to know what was on it. He could feel it in the sudden, Arctic chill that radiated from her. She turned the tablet towards him. It was a grainy but unmistakable paparazzi photo from the gala. It captured the exact moment he had whispered his desperate plea to her, his face a mask of raw need, hers a canvas of stunned silence. The headline screamed, "Heart of Stone Melts? Tech Titan Alara Roth's Secret Romance with Mystery Man Revealed." The subheadline was worse. Sources say the man, identified as one Leo, is a former small business owner who recently declared bankruptcy. What does he really want from the billionaire CEO? The article was a venomous mix of speculation and thinly veiled accusation, painting him as a gold digger and her as a foolish, lonely woman being taken advantage of. "The board is already calling," David said, his voice low. "They're concerned about the optics. The narrative is unstable. They're questioning your judgment." Alara's eyes, when they lifted from the screen to meet Leo's, were no longer the eyes of the woman who had toasted to joy jars. They were the eyes of a strategist who had just discovered a critical flaw in her plan. They were cold, hard, and full of a devastating betrayal. "You," she said, the single word a shard of ice. Leo felt the world drop out from under him. "Alara, no. I had nothing to do with this. I swear to you." "Nothing to do with it?" she repeated, her voice dangerously quiet. She took a step toward him, the tablet held out like evidence in a trial. "This photo is from the moment you first spoke to me. The exact moment. Who else could have tipped them off? Who else knew the significance of that specific second?" She gave a short, bitter laugh. "I should have known. This was the play all along, wasn't it? The poor, desperate man. The humiliating encounter with the ex-wife. It was all a setup to get close to me. To get a payday." Her words were lashings, each one stripping away the connection they had built. The trust that had felt so solid minutes ago now lay in splinters at their feet. "That's not true," he insisted, his voice rising with desperation. "You think I planned this? You think I wanted any of this? I asked you to pretend so I wouldn't feel like a complete failure for one night. That's it. Everything that happened after. That was real." "Real," she spat, the word dripping with contempt. "None of this was real. It was a transaction. I provided a service. And you saw an opportunity. Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think a few sad stories about your dead wife would make me forget that people like you always want something from people like me?" The mention of Lena was a physical blow. Leo recoiled as if she'd struck him. The air left his lungs. The kindness, the understanding, the shared laughter, it had all been a lie. A performance. She had never seen him. She had only ever seen a threat to her portfolio, a variable to be controlled. "People like me?" he whispered, the hurt so profound it had no volume. "Get out," she said, her voice trembling now, not with emotion, but with a fury so controlled it was terrifying. She turned her back on him, walking to the window, dismissing him from her life, from her world. "Get out of my home. David, see that he's escorted from the building." David gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. He gestured towards the bathroom where Leo's damp clothes were. "I'll wait." Leo stood there, naked and shattered in the middle of the opulent room. The bond was destroyed. The lowest point had been reached. He had thought for a few beautiful, foolish hours that he had been seen, that he was worthy of connection. But she had just confirmed his deepest, darkest fear. He was nothing. A problem. A man who was only ever worthy of pity or suspicion. The pretend date was over, and the real him had been found wanting. He turned and walked numbly towards the bathroom to change, the silence of the penthouse now a deafening roar of his own unworthiness. The city had never felt so large or so indifferent. Leo walked, his still damp clothes clinging to him like a second skin of shame. The rain had softened to a fine, chilling mist, but he barely felt it. The cold inside him was far deeper. Her words played on a loop in his mind, a torturous recording. "People like you always want something from people like me." Each syllable was a hammer blow, shattering the fragile self-worth he had begun to rebuild in her presence. He had let his guard down. He had shown her the broken pieces of himself, and she had used them as evidence against him. The connection he had felt, the understanding in her eyes as they spoke of Lena and Clara, it had all been an illusion. A moment of weakness from a CEO who now saw him as a liability to be managed, a leak to be plugged. He reached his studio apartment, the silence there a different kind of assault. It was the silence of failure, of a life reduced to its barest, most pathetic components. He looked at the single chair, the hot plate, the stack of unpaid bills. This was the reality of people like him. And for a few hours he had forgotten it. He had dared to sit in a penthouse and believe he could be an equal. The choice before him was clear, and it felt less like a choice and more like an inevitability. He could fade away. He could accept her judgment as the final, definitive verdict on his life. He could pack what little he had and disappear from the city, from the memory of her, from the ghost of the man he'd almost believed he could be again. It would be the easiest thing in the world. It was the path of least resistance, the one he had been on long before he ever walked into that gala. But as he stood there, his gaze fell upon a small, cardboard box tucked under his bed. He hadn't opened it in over a year. The pain was still too fresh. Now he pulled it out. He lifted the lid. It was Lena's joy jar. Not a fancy ceramic one, but a simple, old mason jar. Inside, a jumble of memories. Faded ticket stubs, a pressed flower from their wedding, a note he'd left on the fridge telling her he loved her. He picked up the concert stub from the Midnight Echoes, the twin to the one in his wallet. He remembered her face, illuminated by the stage lights, pure, unadulterated joy. Lena had never seen him as people like him. She had seen his heart. She had believed in it. And she had fought for their happiness with a ferocity that he had, in his grief, forgotten. You loved her. You fought for her memory. That is not failure. That is loyalty. It's the rarest currency there is. Alara's words, spoken with such conviction in the warmth of her kitchen, came back to him. Had that been a lie too? Or had that been the real Alara, the one buried under the CEO, the one who understood loss? The one who had looked at him and seen a man, not a problem. He thought of her laugh, real and unpolished, under the awning in the rain. He thought of the way she had held his hand at the gala, not as a prop, but as a lifeline. He thought of the vulnerability in her eyes when she spoke of her sister. The choice was no longer about fading away. It was about fighting. Not for her, not for a relationship that might be impossible, but for the truth. For the man Lena had loved. For the connection that had felt more real than anything he'd experienced in years. He would not let Alara's fear and walls define his worth. He had to choose between the safety of his own self-pity and the terrifying risk of believing that what they'd shared, however brief, had been real. In the sterile silence of her penthouse, Alara stood at the window, the city lights blurring into meaningless streaks of color. David had left after delivering a report on the paparazzi outlet. The source, he'd said, was well protected, But the payment had been routed through a shell corporation he was still untangling. The fury had subsided, leaving a cold, hollow emptiness in its wake. She replayed the scene of Leo's face as she'd accused him. The shock, the devastation, wealth
raw
or
hurt
power,
when she'd
but
used
at his
her.
wife against him.
At Alara,
She had
the
seen
woman
that
who
look
loved her
before
sister,
in the mirror,
who had a
after her
terrible,
divorce,
lonely apartment,
when her
who had
ex-wife
for
had
one
coldly
night
explained
forgotten
that
to be
love
a
was a
CEO.
poor substitute.
He had
for a
asked for nothing
significant
but a
stock
moment of
portfolio.
pretend dignity.
She had become what
And
she
in
hated
return,
most. She had given him
she had
genuine
used someone's
cruelty.
deepest pain
Her
as a weapon.
accusation,
She
that
looked
he was
around
like
her perfect,
everyone else,
empty apartment,
was a projection of her
she
own
saw the
deepest
two whiskey
fear.
glasses still
She
on
was
the counter.
unlovable for anything
She heard
but
the
her
echo
money.
of his laughter.
She had pushed
saw
him
the
away
way he
to
had
prove
looked
her
at her,
own cynical
not at
worldview
her.
correct. David's preliminary report suggested the leak was sophisticated, corporate. Not the act of a desperate man. The evidence was pointing away from Leo, and every instinct she had, the one that had built a billion-dollar company, was now screaming that she had been wrong. Terribly, tragically wrong. The choice was before her. She could choose pride. She could let him go, reinforce her walls, and return to the safe, sterile existence of waiting for the next day to begin. She could be right about the world being a cold, transactional place. Or she could choose vulnerability. She could risk the ultimate humiliation, being wrong, being rejected, for the chance to apologize. To look at the one person who had seen past her fortress and say, "I was afraid, and I am sorry." She could choose the terrifying, uncertain path of believing that the connection they'd forged wasn't a lie, but the most real thing to happen to her in years. When you know you've made a terrible mistake with someone who saw the real you, is it pride or courage that stops you from reaching out? She stood at the precipice of her own heart, the weight of the choice heavier than any business decision she had ever made. The knock on his door, 2 days later, was so soft he almost didn't hear it over the hum of the old refrigerator. Leo's heart, which had felt like a stone in his chest since he'd left her penthouse, gave a single, hard thud. He wasn't expecting anyone. The world had left him alone, just as he'd assumed it wanted to. He opened the door, and the air left his lungs. Alara stood there. Not the CEO from the gala, not the furious woman from the penthouse. She was dressed in simple, dark jeans and a black coat, her hair pulled back in a loose ponytail. She looked ordinary, and utterly terrified. There was no limo idling at the curb, no assistant hovering behind her. She was alone. For a long moment, they just looked at each other, the space between them filled with the wreckage of their last encounter. "Leo," she said, his name a quiet exhale. He didn't speak. He couldn't. He just held onto the doorframe, his knuckles white. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice hesitant, stripped of all its usual authority. He nodded, stepping back to let her pass. She walked into the small studio, her eyes taking in the modest space with a curiosity that held no judgment. She saw the single chair, the hot plate, the mason jar sitting on the small table. She saw his life laid bare, and she didn't flinch. "I was wrong," she said, turning to face him. There were no qualifiers, no corporate excuses. Just the stark, honest truth. "The leak didn't come from you. David traced it. It was my ex-wife. She was at the gala, she saw us, and she still has contacts from our divorce. She paid the paparazzi to destabilize me, to make me look foolish and emotionally reckless to the board." She swallowed, her gaze dropping for a moment before meeting his again, steady and clear. "I used the most painful part of your life as a weapon against you. There is no excuse for that. I am so sorry." The apology landed not as a victory, but as a key, turning a lock deep inside him. The tightness in his chest began to ease. "You were right to be suspicious," he said quietly, his own voice rough. "The story was too convenient. The poor man and the rich CEO." "No," she insisted, taking a small step forward. "I wasn't right. I was safe. I chose the story that protected my own fear. The fear that no one could ever want me for just me. That it would always be about the money, the power, the performance." She gestured around his small apartment, a place that held none of those things. "You never asked me for any of that. You only ever asked me to pretend. And then you gave me something real." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "When you spoke about Lena, when you showed me that ticket stub. I saw a love that was so vast, it was worth losing everything for. I have spent my entire life building fortresses to avoid ever feeling a fraction of that loss. But being with you for those few hours made me realize I've just been building a very beautiful, very empty prison. She took another step, now close enough that he could see the faint freckles across her nose, could smell the faint, frosty scent of her perfume mingling with the humble scent of his home. You asked me to pretend like we were dating, she whispered, echoing his desperate plea from the gala. And I am here now to ask you something entirely different. She took a deep, shaky breath. Leah, would you consider going on a real date with me? No pretense. No audience. Just us. The question hung in the air, simple and profound. It wasn't a merger. It wasn't a transaction. It was an invitation, an offering from one vulnerable heart to another. He looked at her, this powerful, lonely, brave woman who had tracked him down to his shabby apartment to lay her pride at his feet. He saw the real Alara, the one behind the Millionaire CEO, the one who loved her sister, who hated her sterile apartment, who was afraid of joy jars but longed for them all the same. A slow, real smile, the first in 2 days, spread across his face. It felt like the sun rising after a long, cold night. I think, he said softly, that would be a very good idea. The relief that washed over her was palpable. A single tear escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She didn't wipe it away. He reached out then, not to straighten a lapel, but to gently take her hand. His touch was warm, sure. It was no longer a lifeline for a drowning man or a prop for a performance. It was a promise, a beginning. But I should warn you, he said, a playful glint returning to his eyes. On our first real date, I'll probably be a little rumpled. The sound she made was half laugh, half sob. She squeezed his hand, her grip firm and real. I'm counting on it. They stood there, in the middle of his simple room, hands linked. The city's noise was a distant murmur. The paparazzi photos, the boardrooms, the gilded galas, it all belonged to another world. Here, in this quiet space, something new and tender was taking root. It wasn't about wealth or poverty, loss or power. It was about two people who had found each other in the wreckage of their old lives and had chosen, against all odds, to build something new together. The pretend date was over. Their real story was just beginning. When love finds you in the most unexpected way, against all logic and past all the pain, what is the first small step you take to embrace it?